So, remember those things called extremophiles that live in strange places like in deep oceanic volcanic vents where the sun never reaches, so no sunlight penetrates, and they're living using the energy of those vents. So, strange places. Genetic studies suggest that the earliest life on Earth resembled those extremophiles that we find in these weird places like geothermal hot springs, etc. Okay, now, you all know that life is based on DNA, life on Earth anyway, and so it relies on these few classes of giant molecules that we call polymers. And of course, the most important classes of these molecules are DNA, RNA, and proteins. So you probably know this, but DNA molecules encode genetic information, and the RNA sort of reads that code, and it's the RNA that's used to make the amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins, and proteins do everything in your body. For instance, your protein hemoglobin binds to oxygen in your red blood cells and carries oxygen around to all the places in your body. So extremely important. And it's the DNA that codes for all those proteins, and that really codes for everything. Okay, so how did we end up with DNA? Well, that's a big question. Um, People first wanted to know, how did we get organic molecules? How did we get the building blocks of DNA? Like nucleic acids, that's what these are called. If you look here, these little A, T, C, G things in RNA and DNA are called nucleic acids. And people wanted to know, well, how did they come about in the first place? Before answering a much harder question, how did DNA come about? Okay, so let's take a look at that. So there was a very famous experiment called the Miller-Urey experiment, in which, starting with just the building blocks that we thought were present in the early Earth, could you spontaneously build nucleic acids and other organic molecules? So let's take a look at a video about that.
Do the molecules of life arise? In a laboratory at Cornell University, we mix together the gases and waters of the primitive Earth, supply some energy, and see if we can make the stuff of life. But what was the early atmosphere made of? Ordinary air? If we start with our present atmosphere, the experiment is a dismal failure. Instead of making proteins and nucleic acids, all we make is smog, a backward step. Why doesn't such an experiment work? Because the air of today contains molecular oxygen. But oxygen is made by plants. It's pretty obvious that there were no plants before the origin of life. We mustn't use oxygen in our experiments because there wasn't any oxygen in the early atmosphere. This is perfectly reasonable because the cosmos is made mostly of hydrogen, which gobbles oxygen up. The Earth's low gravity has allowed most of our original hydrogen gas to trickle away to space. There's almost none left. But 4 billion years ago, our atmosphere was full of hydrogen-rich gases: methane, ammonia, water vapor. These are the gases we should use. Taking great care to ensure the purity of these gases, my colleague Bishan Kari pumps them from their holding flasks. An experiment like this was first performed by Stanley Miller and Harold Urey in the 1950s. The starting gases are now introduced into a large reaction vessel. We could shine ultraviolet light on this mixture, simulating the early sun. But in this experiment, the gases will be sparked, as the primitive atmosphere was, by early lightning. After only a few hours, the interior of the reaction vessel becomes streaked with a strange brown pigment, a rich collection of complex organic molecules, including the building blocks of the proteins and the nucleic acids. Under the right conditions, these building blocks assemble themselves into molecules resembling little proteins and little nucleic acids. These nucleic acids can even make identical copies of themselves. In this vessel are the notes of the music of life, although not yet the music itself. Now, no one so far has mixed together the gases and waters of the primitive Earth and at the end of the experiment had something crawl out of the flask. There's still a great deal to be understood about the origin of life, including the origin of the genetic code. But we've only been at such experiments for 30 years. Nature's had a 4 billion year head start. Incidentally, there's nothing in such experiments that's unique to the Earth. The gases we start with, the energy sources we use, are entirely common through the cosmos. So chemical reactions, something like these, must be responsible for the organic matter in interstellar space and the amino acids in the meteorites. Similar chemical reactions must have occurred on a billion other worlds in the Milky Way galaxy. Look how easy it is to make great globs of this stuff. The molecules of life fill the cosmos.
Okay, so just for your information, the nucleic acids couldn't make copies of themselves. I think that was just a misstatement by Carl Sagan. But it is an important experiment, right? So if you produce these amino acids in a laboratory, that's really only the beginning, but it does tell you that you can produce them from the elements of the early atmosphere. These are sort of what we call the prebiotic molecules, so kind of the setup for biology. They're necessary for life, but they're really not alive. They can't replicate themselves. So really the mystery is, how did molecules gain this ability to encode instructions and make copies? That's a big leap. And the structure of DNA is interesting and important. Its most intriguing attribute is its ability to replicate itself. That is pretty much the most amazing thing I think about DNA. I think a lot of people would agree with me. Although it is amazing how it can encode so much variation in life. So we don't really quite understand how the random chemical reactions sort of led to this, to DNA. But we still write a timeline down, even though sometimes we don't understand how you get from here to here, right? But you have some organic precursor molecules, which we just saw pretty easy to make, given the early atmosphere and an energy source like lightning. And then somehow you get these RNA molecules that self-replicate. Then you get some membranes that then can enclose these RNAs. And then you really get true cells with an RNA genome. And then from there, so RNA we think evolved first, modern cells with a DNA genome, okay? Where RNA is really just the copier and helper to make proteins. So that's how we think that happened. Now, it's one thing to say how we got to unicellular life. It's the other thing to figure out how we got such a huge variety of life on Earth. That's another amazing thing. I think we take that for granted all the time, but there are so many different types of life on this Earth. And how did that unfold? Well, in fact, it's really because we had a very, very long time and we have evolution, which we're going to talk about in a minute. Let's go through some questions first. So DNA, which encodes an organism's genetic information, can duplicate itself, thus ensuring that genetic information can be passed down to offspring. Well, yes, that is true. Okay, self-replicating molecules were the first molecules formed on Earth? No. In fact, we don't know how that happened, right? So that's false. The importance of the Miller-Urey experiment was that scientists were able to develop self-replicating molecules? No. Develop small microorganisms? No. Well, that would be really, really cool. C. Develop prebiotic molecules from simpler molecules. Yes, that is what that experiment showed. Very important step, obviously. Okay, now let's talk about evolution. So once you have self-replicating molecules, then if you have some kind of pressure, and we'll talk about those pressures in a second, natural selection is one of those pressures, can lead to the development of very diverse life forms. And evolution is really the most powerful force that we know of in biology. It works because all life carries genetic information which can be altered. And you probably already know that. Cancer is an alteration of that genetic information caused by some assaults to the system, and sometimes we don't know why that occurs, right? But certainly you can get cancer by having been exposed to too much radiation or too many X-rays, right? So too much UV, right, from the sun, UV light from the sun can cause skin cancer. So that is an alteration of the genetic information that causes cells to go bad. So we know that genetic information can be altered. And if it couldn't be altered, we would not have any life really on Earth except for the very first thing that ever evolved or that ever came to be, some unicellular object maybe. Okay. So what are the principles of evolution? Well, Darwin recognized that genetic traits are passed down from parents to offspring, and of course, everybody knew that at the time. It's very obvious. People were breeding plants and animals by selecting, artificially selecting for traits they liked. Just the way you think about dog breeders, right, have bred lots of different types of dogs by selecting the different traits and only breeding the animals with the traits they want, so that to get other animals with those traits. So if genes change, then the traits are inherited, right? These new traits, if they're beneficial, so I'm not talking about the artificial selection of dog breeding, because very often those traits are not beneficial to the dog. But in natural selection, if you have a change in the genetic code and it gives you a trait that's beneficial, then that trait will tend to propagate through the population because you'll pass it on to your offspring. It'll be good for them too, and they'll pass it, and they'll survive, and they'll pass it on to their offspring, and so on and so on. And so you get more of a propagation for something that's beneficial. If something's not beneficial, then you're more likely to die before you pass anything on, or your children would die before they pass anything on. Okay, so there's sort of 4 basic processes of evolution. Mutation is just where you have a random change that occurs in the genes of an organism. And I'm not sure why my slide is not showing all the different things here. Hold on one second. So mutation causes these random changes to occur in the organism. So for instance, if you have some green beetles and all of a sudden one is just born brown, right? If that one goes off and mates with other green ones, you're going to have some hybrid of green and brown showing up in the population. That's also called evolution, right? We don't think of that every day as evolution. We usually think of natural selection, but there are other ways of populations changing from one to the other. So here was all green. Let's say all the beetles are green in this area. All of a sudden, just randomly, some random mutation happens and you get a brown one. The brown one breeds with some green ones and you get some half brown, half green sort of going on. And you end up in the end with a population that has both green and brown. So that's called evolution as well. Okay. There's, of course, migration, where you might have a population that migrates to a different part of the world and interacts with all the green beetles, and then you end up with green, brown, and in between beetles. Again, this is evolution as well. It's just a different kind that we're used to thinking of. And then there's something called genetic drift, and that one's kind of horrible here. So these green beetles are getting squished here. So what happens is you have some event, like, okay, not a genetic event, but an event like somebody stepping on some of the green beetles here, which means that there are going to be less green beetles in the population in the future, right? Because a bunch of them got killed and they couldn't breed as much, and that changed the makeup of the population. Now, the one that we're most familiar with colloquially, of course, is Darwin's theory of natural selection. And this is a theory that says that an organism with traits that make it better able to survive will reproduce, be able to reproduce better, and those traits will be passed down to their offspring, and those offspring will be more likely to survive, etc. And so in the end, you get more of those offspring because, or more of those in the population with the particular trait. Okay, so we think that natural selection, it certainly is the most successful theory for how organisms went from unicellular life to the huge variety that we have now. And we're going to see a video in a second about this exact thing. I just want to point out that very often we represent life with a tree, right? So we have some common ancestor here, and then we have different branches. Here's bacteria. Here's the archaea, and these guys are the ones where the extremophiles exist, or most of them. And then there's the animals, that's us up here, vertebrates, invertebrates, plants, etc. And eukaryota, you might remember from biology class, are organisms that have nuclei in their cells. Okay, so let's take a look at a video. Again, Carl Sagan.
Now, let's take a closer look at who our ancestors were. A simple chemical circumstance led to one of the great moments in the history of our planet. There were many kinds of molecules in the primordial soup. Some were attracted to water on one side and repelled by it on the other. This drove them together into a tiny enclosed spherical shell, like a soap bubble, which protected the interior. Within the bubble, the ancestors of DNA found a home, and the first cell arose. It took hundreds of millions of years for tiny plants to evolve, giving off oxygen. But that branch didn't lead to us. Bacteria that could breathe oxygen took over 1 billion more years to evolve. From a naked nucleus, a cell developed with a nucleus inside. Some of these amoeba-like forms led eventually to plants. Others produced colonies, with inside and outside cells performing different functions, becoming a polyp attached to the ocean floor, filtering food from the water, and evolving little tentacles to direct food into a primitive mouth. This humble ancestor of ours also led to spiny-skinned, armored animals with internal organs, including our cousin, the starfish. But we don't come from starfish. About 550 million years ago, filter feeders evolved gill slits, which were more efficient at straining food particles from the water. One evolutionary branch led to acorn worms. Another led to a creature which swam freely in the larval stage, but as an adult was still firmly anchored to the ocean floor. Some became living hollow tubes, but others retained the larval forms throughout the life cycle and became free-swimming adults with something like a backbone. Our ancestors now, 500 million years ago, were jawless, filter-feeding fish, a little like lampreys. Gradually, those tiny fish evolved eyes and jaws. Fish then began to eat one another. If you could swim fast, you survived. If you had jaws to eat with, you could now use your gills to breathe the oxygen in the water. This is the way modern fish arose. During the summer, some swamps and lakes dried up, So some fish evolved a primitive lung to breathe air until the rains came. Their brains were getting bigger. If the rains didn't come, it was handy to be able to pull yourself along to the next swamp. That was a very important adaptation. The first amphibians evolved, still with a fish-like tail. Amphibians, like fish, laid their eggs in water where they were easily eaten. But then a splendid new invention came along, the hard-shelled egg laid on the land where there were as yet no predators. Reptiles and turtles go back to those days. Many of the reptiles hatched on land never returned to the waters. Some became the dinosaurs. One line of dinosaurs developed feathers useful for short flights. Today, the only living descendants of the dinosaurs are the birds. The great dinosaurs evolved along another branch. Some were the largest flesh eaters ever to walk the land. But 65 million years ago, they all mysteriously perished. Meanwhile, the forerunners of the dinosaurs were also evolving in a different direction. Small, scurrying creatures, with the young growing inside the mother's body. After the extinction of the dinosaurs, many different forms developed. The young were very immature at birth. In the marsupials, the wombat, for example, and in the mammals. The young had to be taught how to survive. The brain grew larger still. Something like a shrew was the ancestor of all the mammals. One line took to the trees, developing dexterity, stereovision, larger brains, and a curiosity about their environment. Some became baboons, but that's not the line to us. Apes and humans have a recent common ancestor. Bone for bone, muscle for muscle, molecule for molecule. There are almost no important differences between apes and humans. Unlike the chimpanzee, our ancestors walked upright, freeing their hands to poke and fix and experiment. We got smarter. We began to talk. Many collateral branches of the human family became extinct in the last few million years. We, with our brains in our hands, are the survivors. There's an unbroken thread that stretches from those first cells to us. Let's look at it again, compressing 4 billion years of evolution into 40 seconds. Those things that molecules do, given 4 billion years of evolution. We sometimes represent evolution as the ever-branching ramifications of some original trunk, each branch pruned and clipped by natural selection. Every plant and animal alive today has a history as ancient and illustrious as ours. Humans stand on one branch, but now we affect the future of every branch of this 4 billion year old tree.
Okay, so now let's try a question. Pause your video.